A cold wind sweeps across the desolate dunes of Long Island's South Shore. The waves crash against the sand in a rhythmic, indifferent pulse, as if the ocean itself keeps the secrets of those who vanish here. Gilgo Beach, once known for its quiet beauty, will become the stage for one of America's most unsettling unsolved mysteries. It began, as many modern investigations do, with a single missing person. In May 2010, a young woman named Shannon Gilbert disappeared after a frantic 911 call. Her voice trembled with fear as she told the operator someone was after her. She ran to the dark streets of Oak Beach, a gated community not far from the Atlantic's edge, banging on doors, begging for help, and then silence. When officers arrived, Shannon was gone. What should have been a straightforward missing person search soon spiraled into something far darker, something no one expected. Days turned into weeks. Investigators combed the marshes and thickets, trudging through reeds and icy puddles, searching for any sign of her. But what they found instead were other bodies. In December 2010, while looking for Shannon, police discovered 4 sets of human remains along Ocean Parkway, each wrapped in burlap and buried within a few hundred feet of one another. None of them were Shannon. They were women, all young, all missing for years, and all known to have worked as escorts who advertised their services online. The names that would soon fill headlines were Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. Reporters quickly dubbed them the Gilgo Four. For investigators, this was no longer a search for a missing woman. It was a hunt for a serial predator, one who had been operating in plain sight for years, and possibly still was. The discovery ignited a storm of fear. Residents of Long Island, who had always felt insulated from big city crime, were suddenly thrust into the middle of a nightmare. The idea that someone could kill repeatedly, dispose of bodies along a well-traveled highway, and remain undetected for so long, it was unthinkable. Law enforcement began to coordinate at every level. The Suffolk County Police Department, New York State Police, and the FBI joined forces. The area became a massive crime scene, stretching for miles along the coastal parkway. Drones, helicopters, and search dogs swept the area. Cadaver dogs barked at patches of disturbed sand. Investigators laid markers, photographs, and sketches across an ever-expanding map of victims. The media swarmed. News vans lined Ocean Parkway, cameras rolling as investigators carried evidence bags out of the tall grass. Headlines screamed phrases like "serial killer on Long Island" and "bodies found by the beach." Every newscast deepened the mystery. Who was a man or possibly woman responsible for these deaths? Why did the bodies all end up here, in this lonely corridor between the Atlantic and the highway? And could it all somehow connect back to the missing woman who started it, Shannon Gilbert? Detectives began piecing together timelines. Each of the Gilgo Four had vanished under similar circumstances, last seen alive arranging meetings with clients through Craigslist between 2007 and 2010. Each had left home expecting to return. None ever did. The use of burlap, the choice of dumping ground, the pattern of victims, everything suggested a careful, deliberate killer, one who was organized, intelligent, and aware of how law enforcement worked. As winter deepened, so did the mystery. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, familiar with some of America's most infamous serial cases, quietly profiled the suspect. Likely male, middle-aged, familiar with the area, and possibly living or working within driving distance of Gilgo Beach. They believed the killer might even have law enforcement or military experience, based on the precision of the body placements and the lack of forensic evidence. Still, the question haunted everyone involved. Was he still out there? While investigators scoured the dunes, locals began to lock their doors earlier. Parents told their children not to wander near the shore. Taxi drivers refused to take fares to Oak Beach after dark. And in every cafe and gas station from Babylon to Jones Beach, the conversation was the same: the killer by the coast. The case seemed to grow colder even as it expanded. In early 2011, more remains were found, this time beyond Gilgo Beach. Partial skeletons, scattered evidence, and fragments belonging to different victims stretched miles apart. Some of the newly discovered remains were linked by DNA to earlier cases from years before, including unidentified victims from Nassau County and even as far away as Fire Island. This was no recent spree. This was the work of someone who had been active for over a decade. But still, one critical piece was missing: Shannon Gilbert herself. Her mother, Mari Gilbert, became one of the most determined voices in the search. She appeared on television, urging the police not to give up. She believed Shannon's disappearance was directly connected to the other victims, that her daughter had stumbled into the path of the killer. Investigators weren't so sure. Some argued that Shannon's case was separate, that her death, if she was dead, might have been accidental. Yet the timing, the location, and the eerie similarities were too much for many to ignore. By the time spring came, over 10 sets of remains had been found along the southern edge of Long Island. Some were linked to the Gilgo Four. Others belonged to victims from years earlier, including an unidentified toddler and a man whose presence only deepened confusion. The media dubbed the unknown perpetrator the Long Island serial killer, or simply LISK, a name that would linger in the true crime world for more than a decade. As the press coverage intensified, so did public frustration. People wanted answers, and they wanted arrests. Yet investigators found themselves trapped. A case with hundreds of leads, but no faces, no clear suspects, and a growing list of victims whose stories deserved justice. And as the years dragged on, the quiet beaches of Long Island became a place of uneasy remembrance. Each gust of wind across the dunes seemed to whisper the same question: who is he? The search for that answer was only beginning. The winter air cut like glass along Ocean Parkway as police cars idled beside the dunes. What began as a missing person search for Shannon Gilbert had transformed into a nightmare, a discovery site so large that even seasoned detectives found themselves shaken. Day after day, officers in hazmat suits combed through the underbrush, their boots sinking into the soft sand. Evidence markers dotted the ground like confetti. A hairbrush here, a shoe there, fragments of burlap tangled in seagrass. The area was eerily quiet except for the sound of surf and radios crackling in the distance. The investigation quickly turned into one of the largest multi-agency efforts in Long Island's history. The FBI, Suffolk County Police, state troopers, and forensic anthropologists all worked side by side, mapping each find with meticulous precision. Helicopters hovered overhead, scanning from above with heat-sensing cameras, while officers on foot documented every inch of terrain. Detective Dominic Verone, one of the lead investigators, described it as a case that kept multiplying. Every time they expanded the search zone, they found more. By April 2011, the body count had risen, not just 4, but 10 sets of remains, each in varying states of decomposition and distance from one another. The discoveries extended beyond Gilgo Beach toward Jones Beach and Tobay Beach, covering nearly 15 miles of coastline. But what confounded investigators most was a variety of victims. Some were clearly connected. Adult women in their 20s missing after online escort meetings. Others, however, didn't fit the pattern. A toddler believed to be around 2 years old, a man, and several victims who had been dead far longer than the Gilgo Four. The Suffolk County Police Commissioner addressed the press cautiously. "We may be dealing with more than one killer," he said, a chilling statement that set off a media firestorm. News channels ran continuous updates. "Serial killer on Long Island," read one banner. "Bodies keep appearing by the beach." Talk shows debated theories, criminologists dissected patterns, and internet sleuths began their own investigations. Forums buzzed with speculation. Some blamed a single calculated predator. Others believed the area had become a dumping ground for multiple killers. For the people living nearby, fear settled like fog. Families who once spent weekends by the shore now avoided it entirely. Runners changed their routes. Dog walkers stayed inland. Even the sound of helicopters, once reassuring, began to feel ominous. Meanwhile, police were piecing together what little they had. Phone records showed that one of the victims, Melissa Barthélemy, had received a series of taunting phone calls to her family after she disappeared. The calls came from crowded places in Manhattan. Times Square, Penn Station, always brief, always chillingly controlled. The caller's voice was calm, deliberate, and male. He knew details that hadn't been made public. But despite using cell towers in heavily populated areas, he left almost no trace. When investigators tried to triangulate his location, he vanished from the network, switching phones, changing patterns. It was as if he knew exactly how to stay one step ahead. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit began constructing a profile. The suspect, they believed, was organized and methodical. He likely lived or worked on Long Island, possibly with ties to law enforcement or a profession that required attention to detail, maybe construction, security, or technology. He was someone who blended in, a family man, perhaps someone who waved at his neighbors, mowed his lawn, paid his taxes, all while harboring a monstrous secret. For every answer, new questions appeared. Why were the bodies so close together, yet discovered years apart? Why had no one seen anything suspicious? And what, if anything, did Shannon Gilbert's disappearance have to do with the others? Shannon's mother, Mari, refused to stay silent. She appeared on television, demanding that the police take her daughter's case seriously. "My daughter didn't just run into a swamp," she said. "Someone chased her." Her persistence kept the case alive in the headlines, ensuring that the public and the police never forgot. By summer 2011, search teams widened their focus again. More bones surfaced, some belonging to women who had gone missing as far back as the 1990s. DNA confirmed links between some of the new finds and partial remains discovered years earlier in Nassau County. Whoever was responsible had been killing for a long time. The lack of forensic evidence frustrated everyone. There were no fingerprints, no traceable fibers, no usable DNA at most sites. The killer was either extraordinarily cautious or extremely lucky. The Suffolk County Police formed a special task force dedicated solely to the case, combining digital forensics, behavioral profiling, and geographic analysis. They mapped every known victim's disappearance, their last phone calls, their final sightings, their online activity. Patterns emerged. Each victim had been contacted through online ads, and in most cases, the meetings occurred near the same cluster of highways connecting to Gilgo Beach. The killer used burner phones, prepaid, disposable, untraceable. He called, arranged meetings, and then discarded the devices. Investigators tracked more than 300 burner phone records, tried to find a match that would lead them back to a real identity. But every lead dissolved. At times, the case felt cursed. Internal disputes broke out between agencies. The Suffolk County Police Department and the FBI reportedly clashed over control of the investigation. Political scandals within local law enforcement further complicated cooperation, raising public suspicion that someone inside might know more than they were saying. By late 2011, the case had reached a standstill. Dozens of detectives were still assigned to it, yet they were no closer to identifying the killer than when the first bodies were found. Still, the horror of it all refused to fade. Documentaries began airing on national networks. Podcasts and true crime forums debated theories, some plausible, others wild. People dissected every photo from the search scenes, every leaked detail, every map of the dumping grounds. Yet amid the noise, one haunting truth remained. There was still no name, no face, no justice. The only constant was the beach, silent, indifferent, endless. As 2012 dawned, the sands began to reclaim the markers and flags left behind by investigators. The ocean breeze erased footprints, and the dunes swallowed the traces of the search. But somewhere, the person responsible was still out there, watching the headlines, perhaps even passing the same beaches, knowing he had fooled them all. And though the case appeared to stall, beneath the surface, a storm was building, one that would reignite the investigation more than a decade later. By 2012, Long Island was no longer just a suburban paradise of beaches and boardwalks. It had become the backdrop of a national nightmare. Every newspaper headline, every nightly news broadcast carried the same haunting phrase, the Long Island serial killer. It was a name that evoked both fascination and dread, a mystery stretching across miles of coastline and more than a decade of silence. The story had everything the media craved: mystery, fear, unanswered questions, and the possibility that a ruthless predator was still among them. The Gilgo Beach murders were no longer just a local case. They had become a symbol of modern America's deepest unease, the idea that even in safe, familiar neighborhoods, evil could hide in plain sight. Journalists camped outside police headquarters. True crime authors began drafting books before the investigation was even over. Cable news hosts dissected theories live on air, inviting former FBI profilers to explain the killer's potential psychology. But the saturation came with consequences. Every rumor, every unconfirmed report, spun the story further into confusion. Some media outlets painted the police as heroes tirelessly chasing a ghost. Others accused them of incompetence, corruption, or even cover-ups. And through it all, the victims' families watched, desperate for answers, yet helpless as the narrative slipped beyond their control. Shannon Gilbert's mother, Mari, became one of the most outspoken voices. She attended vigils, appeared on national shows, and demanded accountability. To her, Shannon's disappearance wasn't just another tragedy. It was the key that could unlock everything. "I believe my daughter found a killer," she said in one televised interview, her voice trembling but resolute. "And that's why she's gone." Her words resonated with many, but not everyone agreed. Police maintained that Shannon's death might have been accidental, a tragic case of panic and misdirection in the dark marshland. Still, the public saw patterns the police didn't. Online communities began connecting dots across decades of unsolved disappearances along the East Coast. Some amateur sleuths suggested multiple killers, possibly even organized rings. Others pointed fingers at individuals, neighbors, police officers, businessmen, anyone who seemed suspicious. The hysteria was palpable. Residents of Oak Beach and Gilgo Beach found themselves under siege by cameras and conspiracy theorists. Strangers drove through the gated community, snapping photos of houses. Journalists knocked on doors at midnight. Private investigators offered their services to families who couldn't afford to wait for official answers. For a while, it felt like everyone on Long Island was living inside a crime story, one that refused to end. Meanwhile, inside police headquarters, the investigation grew increasingly tangled. Leads flooded in by the hundreds, most turning to dust. Anonymous tips, psychic claims, and false confessions all distracted from meaningful progress. The task force faced another problem, a lack of trust between agencies. The FBI and Suffolk County Police disagreed over jurisdiction. Some detectives suspected political interference, especially after the controversial tenure of former police chief James Burke, who later served time in prison for unrelated charges involving obstruction of justice. That revelation reignited public outrage. How could justice be served, people asked, when even those in power were compromised? The case's credibility suffered, but the story refused to die. Every anniversary brought renewed interest. True crime podcasts began re-examining the evidence. Internet detectives pored over aerial photos and phone records. The phrase LISK became a digital obsession, with Reddit threads and YouTube documentaries trying to uncover the killer's identity. The psychological profile of the suspect became a frequent topic among experts. Behavioral analysts described someone who was highly controlled and socially functional, possibly with a double life. He likely followed media coverage closely, taking pleasure in confusion he caused. He wasn't impulsive. He was patient, perhaps even intelligent enough to study investigative methods. And that patience was his greatest weapon. Years passed, and the case began to drift into the category of cold. Detectives retired. Files gathered dust, and the world moved on to newer headlines. But not everyone forgot. For the families, time didn't dull the pain, it sharpened it. The longer the silence lasted, the more unbearable it became. Mari Gilbert continued to fight for her daughter's case, refusing to accept the official explanation. Her advocacy kept Shannon's story alive, reminding the world that behind the headlines were real people, daughters, sisters, mothers. In 2016, tragedy struck again when Mari herself was killed in an unrelated family incident, a heartbreaking end to a woman who had spent her final years demanding justice. To many, she had become a symbol of perseverance, a mother who refused to let her child's story fade into the ocean air. After her death, Shannon's case was re-examined once more. Forensic experts analyzed her remains, and new theories emerged. Some suggested she may have died accidentally, lost and disoriented in the marsh. Others believed she had indeed encountered the killer that night, someone who lived nearby, someone who had heard her screams and done nothing. But without solid evidence, the mystery persisted. By the late 2010s, the Long Island serial killer had become almost mythical, an invisible figure haunting both the coastline and the collective imagination. His story inspired documentaries, crime series, and online forums filled with armchair detectives trying to solve what the FBI couldn't. Every few months, a new suspect made headlines. A doctor, a fisherman, a police officer, even a local resident known for odd behavior. But each lead eventually fell apart. What made the case so haunting wasn't just the killer's cruelty. It was his disappearance into normalcy. Whoever he was, he seemed to melt back into everyday life, leaving no fingerprints, no tracks, no confession. The beaches remained beautiful. Families still picnicked there. Joggers returned. Life resumed. But an unease lingered like a shadow that wouldn't fade. For the people who lived near Gilgo Beach, there was no forgetting. They knew the dunes held secrets. They knew the sea could keep them. And as time went on, that haunting question echoed louder. Would the killer ever be found? Years would pass before the answer finally began to take shape. An answer born not from new witnesses or confessions, but from technology, patience, and a crucial mistake that would finally pierce through the fog. By 2013, the case had begun to cool, not from lack of interest, but from exhaustion. Years of searching, questioning, and speculating had yielded little more than frustration. Each lead dissolved into another dead end. Each promising clue faded beneath layers of red tape, rumor, and doubt. The Gilgo Beach murders, once front-page news, slowly slipped down the headlines. Other stories took their place. But for the families of the victims, the silence was deafening. Detectives still worked the case, but progress was glacial. The coastal winds continued to erase footprints, and time itself seemed to protect the killer. Technology that had once seemed advanced in 2010 was already outdated. Phone records were lost to time. Burner phones had been long destroyed. Yet, in small ways, the investigation endured. Files were digitized, evidence preserved, and databases expanded. The FBI's combined DNA index system, CODIS, continued to grow, and every few years, new technology promised new hope. Still, the truth remained buried, both literally and figuratively, beneath the sands of Long Island. Then came the silence. For nearly a decade, the case sat dormant. No new bodies were discovered. No new calls were traced. The Long Island serial killer seemed to vanish, just as he always had. But in that stillness, the world around him changed. By the late 2010s, advances in forensic genealogy had begun reshaping the field of criminal investigation. Cold cases once thought unsolvable were being cracked wide open. The Golden State Killer, the NorCal Rapist, and dozens of others. Detectives who had once relied solely on fingerprints and witness statements were now using DNA to build family trees that led to suspects' doorsteps. The technology gave new hope to Gilgo Beach investigators. They revisited the evidence, the burlap fibers, the hair strands, the tiny fragments that had been preserved under careful conditions. Some of the DNA was too degraded to test. But one small piece, a single hair found on the burlap that wrapped one of the victims, became their new starting point. Still, bureaucratic tension lingered. The case had spanned multiple police commissioners, each with a different approach. In 2020, under new leadership, Suffolk County finally formed a renewed Gilgo Beach Homicide Task Force, working closely with the FBI and state forensic experts. They began to rebuild the case from the ground up, re-examining every map, every phone record, every photo. Decades-old data was reanalyzed with fresh eyes and better tools. And then something shifted. Using cell tower records from 2010, the same ones that had once seemed useless, investigators began to triangulate call patterns from burner phones used to contact several of the victims. To their surprise, multiple phones had pinged the same cell towers near a small cluster of Long Island neighborhoods, including one in Massapequa Park. It wasn't proof, but it was a start. They overlaid the data with vehicle records, public records, and professional licenses. They filtered through thousands of residents who matched the profile, middle-aged men living near the area during the time of the murders. One name kept reappearing, Rex Hoyerman, an architect, a husband, a father, someone who commuted to Manhattan for work every day. To his neighbors, he was quiet and unremarkable, a man who kept to himself, lived in a modest home, and seemed utterly ordinary. But beneath that ordinary life, investigators began to notice details that matched the profile built years earlier. Hoyerman owned several vehicles matching descriptions linked to witness sightings near the victim's last known locations. He had an extensive collection of burner phones. And when detectives subpoenaed his cell data, they found that his personal phone had frequently been in the same areas as the burner phones used to contact victims, often within minutes of one another. It was circumstantial but compelling. The task force began surveillance. They watched him for months. They followed his routine, commuting to his Manhattan office, returning home late, shopping, walking his dog. Nothing seemed overtly suspicious. But behind the scenes, investigators were building a mountain of evidence. They traced his email addresses, his search history, his vehicle registrations. Digital forensics began to reveal disturbing patterns, repeated searches for victims' names, details of the case, and even location of the bodies. One night, in 2022, investigators followed him to a pizzeria. After he left, they collected a discarded pizza box and water bottle. Forensic technicians lifted DNA from the crust and compared it to the genetic material found on the burlap from one of the Gilgo 4 victims. The results were unmistakable. The DNA matched, not directly to Rex Hoyerman, but to a male relative, likely his father. That was enough. Months of additional testing confirmed the link. After more than a decade of speculation, the police finally had a suspect. In July 2023, the world watched as news broke. An arrest had been made in connection with the Gilgo Beach murders. Rex Hoyerman, a 59-year-old architect from Massapequa Park, was taken into custody outside his office in Midtown Manhattan. Investigators swarmed his home, a small red house surrounded by overgrown weeds, sitting quietly on a suburban street. Inside, they found evidence that would stun even seasoned detectives. Hundreds of guns, locked safes, personal items, and digital records that painted a chilling portrait of obsession. To the community, it was surreal. Neighbors stood on sidewalks as police trucks came and went, whispering that the quiet man next door, the one who said hello, who mowed his lawn, might have been responsible for the horror that haunted Long Island for years. But even with the arrest, questions multiplied. Was Rex Hoyerman truly the Long Island serial killer? Had he acted alone? And what about the other remains? The victims not part of the Gilgo 4? Investigators remained cautious. They described Hoyerman as the primary suspect in the initial 4 murders, but the broader case, the unidentified remains, the older victims, was still officially open. The arrest reignited global attention. Cameras once again crowded the quiet beach towns. Headlines flashed across the world. Gilgo Beach suspect captured after 13 years. For the first time in more than a decade, there was something resembling hope, a name, a face, a possibility of justice. Yet, for those who lived with the case for so long, relief came with hesitation. They knew this story wasn't over. The arrest was just one chapter in a mystery that still had many unanswered questions. When the news broke in July 2023, it felt like a collective exhale. For years, Long Island had lived in the shadow of fear, whispers of a monster who walked among them. And now, for the first time, that shadow had a name. But even as Rex Hoyerman's mugshot flashed across screens, disbelief ran deep. The man described by neighbors was far from the cold, calculating figure investigators had painted. They called him quiet, polite, the kind of man you'd never notice. Yet behind that unassuming facade, detectives now believed was a life divided. One part family man, the other an obsessive hunter who had managed to outwit police for over a decade. The investigation intensifies. In the weeks following his arrest, law enforcement poured over every inch of Hoyerman's life. His home in Massapequa Park became a scene of relentless searching. Forensic teams working day and night, digging through decades of belongings. Hundreds of pieces of evidence were cataloged: computers, hard drives, notebooks, maps, and thousands of images. Investigators dismantled walls, tore up floorboards, even scanned the yard for buried materials. To the public, it looked like the biggest forensic sweep Long Island had ever seen. For detectives, It was a delicate balance between uncovering the truth and maintaining the integrity of a case that had captured global attention. Media trucks lined the narrow suburban street, their lights washing the small red house in a constant glare. Journalists called it the House of Secrets. Neighbors stood on lawns, watching as teams carried boxes of evidence out into the night. Some whispered about eerie encounters, small moments that, in hindsight, seemed strange. Others refused to believe the man they'd seen every day was capable of such things. A nation watching. Across the country, the story dominated the news cycle. Morning shows dissected every detail. Crime podcasts revisited theories, and YouTube channels flooded with breakdowns of the arrest. People compared the case to the Zodiac Killer, to BTK, killers who had blended into everyday life while hiding unspeakable secrets. Social media was relentless. Photos of Hoyerman's house became memes. Timelines filled with amateur sleuthing, and endless threads debated whether the police had truly found their man. Yet beneath the noise, there was something more meaningful, a renewed empathy for the victims whose names had too often been forgotten. Shannon Gilbert, Melissa Barthélemy, Amber Lynn Costello, Megan Waterman, the Gilgo Four. Their stories were retold, their humanity restored. They were no longer just names on case files. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, real people whose lives have been reduced to mystery for too long. The psychology of control. Experts and profilers began to analyze the case from a psychological lens. What drives someone like this? How could a person maintain such duality? A life so normal on the surface, yet harboring such darkness beneath. Forensic psychologists spoke of control, the defining trait of most serial offenders. It wasn't about chaos or rage. It was about dominance, manipulation, and the thrill of invisibility. The Long Island serial killer, whoever he was, had thrived on being unseen. He didn't taunt police or leave notes like Zodiac. He didn't seek fame. Instead, he hid behind anonymity, choosing victim society too often ignored, women on the margins, living lives few bothered to protect. That invisibility gave him power, and that same invisibility nearly allowed him to disappear forever. Law enforcement's reckoning. Inside the Suffolk County Police Department, the arrest marked both triumph and reflection. For years, the department had been criticized for mismanagement of the case, accused of secrecy, infighting, and even corruption under former leadership. Now, with an arrest in hand, officials face questions not just about how they caught him, but why it took so long. Some retired detectives admitted mistakes. Leads that should have been followed were overlooked. Internal disputes had slowed progress. In some ways, the investigation had become a mirror for systemic flaws in policing itself. The new task force, composed of local police, state troopers, and FBI agents, represented a turning point. It proved that cooperation and transparency could achieve what years of isolation could not. Still, the lesson was bittersweet. For more than a decade, the victims' families had fought for attention, begging authorities to keep the case alive. They had organized vigils, held fundraisers, and pushed for reform. Without them, the story might have been buried forever beneath the dunes. The courtroom and the world's eyes. As the case moved into the courtroom, the world watched once more. Prosecutors presented the evidence. DNA on burlap, cell tower data, internet searches, and the disturbing double life of a man who'd appeared so ordinary. Hoyerman pleaded not guilty. His defense team painted him as a family man, an easy scapegoat caught in a media storm. But the evidence was mounting, and the tone of the trial was different from most high-profile cases. It wasn't sensationalized. It was methodical, deliberate. Each revelation peeled back another layer of the mystery that had gripped Long Island for over a decade. Even now, the trial continues, not in the sense of courtroom proceedings alone, but in the broader public conscience. Every new fact, every press release, every interview with investigators add a new piece to a puzzle that may never be complete. The broader impact. The Gilgo Beach case changed the way law enforcement approached serial investigations. It reinforced the value of forensic genealogy, data re-examination, and interagency cooperation. It proved that patience, technology, and persistence could bring justice, even after years of silence. For the community, it was a wake-up call. It forced conversations about safety, about how victims are portrayed, and about how easily society overlooks those on the margins. For families of other unsolved cases, it offers a fragile kind of hope that someday their own mysteries might finally be answered too. The weight of closure. Yet, even as progress was made, the word closure felt complicated. For the families, no arrest could erase the pain of what was lost. For investigators, no conviction could undo the years of doubt and frustration. But there was solace in knowing that, at last, truth had begun to surface. And somewhere along the windswept coast of Gilgo Beach, where the tide still rises and falls against the dunes, a sense of peace had started to return. The ocean keeps its secrets well, but even the deepest waters cannot hide the truth forever. The wind along Gilgo Beach has a sound all its own. It's soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing, the kind of sound that carries memory. For years, that sound has been a haunting reminder of unanswered questions. But now, after more than a decade of silence, it also carries something else. The faint echo of resolution. The arrest of Rex Heuermann didn't end the mystery entirely. It simply brought light to a story that had lived too long in the dark. And yet, that light revealed much more than just one man's secret. It exposed how easily truth can be buried when society chooses not to look close enough. The human toll. For the families, justice has always been about more than one suspect or one trial. It's about acknowledgement. The world finally recognizing the people behind the headlines. Over the years, vigils have been held along Ocean Parkway. Candles, flowers, and photos of the victims line the boardwalk. Families gather in quiet circles, speaking names aloud so they're never forgotten. When the arrest came, many wept, not because their grief had ended, but because someone had finally listened. One mother said softly to a reporter, "It's not closure, it's clarity. We finally see the truth through the fog." The emotion was shared by a community that had been haunted for years. Gilgo Beach was no longer just a place of fear. It had become a place of remembrance, media, and memory. The case of the Long Island serial killer reshaped how the media approaches true crime. In the early years, coverage often leaned toward sensationalism, emphasizing the lurid details, the mystery, the idea of a monster. But as time passed, a shift occurred. Journalists began focusing on the lives lost, not the killer's myth. Documentaries and podcasts reframed the narrative, humanizing the victims and exposing the systemic failures that allowed the case to go unsolved for so long. This change mirrored a larger transformation in how society talks about violence and justice. It wasn't about glorifying evil anymore. It was about understanding it, confronting it, and learning from it. Because the truth is simple. These stories don't just belong to history. They belong to the people left behind. Lessons in investigation. From a law enforcement perspective, the Gilgo Beach case became a case study in both failure and redemption. For years, turf wars and secrecy slowed progress. But once agencies began working together, local police, the FBI, and state investigators, everything changed. The lesson was clear. Collaboration is not optional. It's essential. The use of forensic genealogy, data analytics, and modern communication tracing marked a new era for solving cold cases. Detectives now know that even the smallest piece of evidence, a hair, a fiber, a digital signal, can one day unlock the truth. The case also sparked reforms in Suffolk County policing, including the creation of independent oversight committees and victim advocacy programs to ensure transparency in future investigations. In that sense, the victim stories didn't just end with tragedy. They became the catalyst for change. The psychology of a double life. The question still lingers in the minds of many. How could someone like Rex Heuermann live such a double life? Psychologists who study the case describe a man who compartmentalizes identity so completely that the two versions of himself barely touched. At work, he was meticulous, an architect known for precision. At home, he was ordinary, a husband and father with no visible signs of darkness. This psychological duality, the ability to appear normal while harboring sinister secrets, has long fascinated and frightened the public. But it also underscores an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always look like what we expect. It hides in plain sight. It blends in. It waits. That's perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all. Unanswered questions. Even now, not everything fits neatly into place. Authorities believe Hoyerman is responsible for at least 4 murders, but there are other remains along Gilgo Beach and neighboring areas that may or may not be connected. Could there have been multiple perpetrators? Could some victims predate Hoyerman's involvement? Investigators haven't ruled it out. They continue to test evidence, revisit timelines, and explore links to other unsolved cases across the region. In a way, the mystery of Gilgo Beach is still alive, not because of what unsolved, but because of what it represents. The endless human pursuit of truth, a legacy of awareness. Out of tragedy often comes awareness, and from awareness, change. The Gilgo case brought national attention to the vulnerabilities faced by sex workers and marginalized individuals. It shed light on how society's biases can allow predators to operate unseen. Advocacy groups now use the case as a rallying cry for reform, calling for better safety measures, digital tracking protections, and respect for all victims, regardless of background. That legacy, more than any arrest or trial, might be the story's most enduring impact. The shoreline today. Today, Gilgo Beach looks much like it did before the story began. Quiet, wind-blown, peaceful. The ocean still rolls against the sand. The dunes still shift with each season. But for those who know the story, every gust of wind feels like a whisper from the past. Some locals avoid the stretch of road where the remains were found. Others visit it deliberately, leaving flowers or handwritten notes beneath the tall grass. The place has become both a scar and a shrine, a reminder of what darkness can hide and how determination can bring it to light. Final reflection. The mystery of the Long Island serial killer is more than a crime story. It's a story about time, persistence, and the fragile balance between evil and justice. It reminds us that monsters don't always wear masks. Sometimes they were the face of normalcy. It reminds us that truth can sleep beneath silence for years, waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up. And above all, it reminds us that even the darkest chapters of human nature can teach us something vital about compassion, vigilance, and resilience. The case is still open, not in the legal sense, but in the emotional one, because mysteries like this don't truly end. They echo, they ripple across generations, challenging us to look closer, listen harder, and never stop asking questions. And as the tide continues to wash over Gilgo Beach, those echoes remain, carried by the wind, whispered by the waves, reminding the world that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way back to shore.